right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Sarah Kellogg. I am currently a visiting scholar here at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. I am on a Hunt postdoctoral fellowship from the Leonard Wren Foundation, which enables me to basically revise my doctoral dissertation into a book for publication. And I am nearing the end of that beautiful period of my life within a couple of months. So quick acknowledgements. I also need to thank the Institute for Ethnographic Research, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Music Department, and the Institute for European Studies for co-sponsoring my talk today. And a special thank you to the Institute of European Studies for making this project possible with a preliminary fieldwork grant they gave me many years ago in graduate school. So I continue to appreciate it. I'm also grateful to Jonathan and Mark, the co-directors here at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, for hosting me. And I'm especially grateful to Charles Hirschkind for making it possible for me to be here, and for being generally extremely supportive of a kind of quirky project for many years. So to start with, I actually think I am going to stand. This is a story about family. It is also a story about kinship, which is not the same thing. I'm going to put off pinning down exactly what I mean by these two words and how I distinguish them for reasons that I hope will become clear. For now, I'd like to say that they both refer, in slightly different ways, to a modality of irreducible relatedness, the smallest possible unit of relationship to which we feel bound, not by choice or affinity, but as a function of who we imagine ourselves inherently to be. This might be an accident of birth or some other seemingly inescapable circumstance. In the politics of racial and religious diversity in Western Europe, especially in countries that think of themselves as generally progressive as the Netherlands, doing family right is a big deal. Especially if you are a recent or not so recent immigrant, how you raise your children, how you treat your spouse, how you envision and care for the physical and psychological well-being of your kin is subject to intense and often well-meaning scrutiny. And it is, for many European states, a litmus test of civilization itself. A test that many racialized religious minorities from the Middle East and North Africa especially are often accused of failing. How one understands what it is to be kin and how one enacts one's sense of kin-relatedness are hugely political questions. When I began this project, I decided to investigate this question of the politicization of kinship from the often ignored perspective of Middle Eastern Christianity, in hopes that it would help me tease apart the racial and religious dimensions of secular European attitudes towards new minorities from the Middle East and North Africa, which tend to fixate on perceptions of Muslim difference. This took me on a journey through ethnomusicology, religious studies, liturgical theology, and the history and historiography of the late antique and medieval Middle East. But this project fundamentally remains what some scholars call a political anthropology of morality. I'm an anthropologist, and I started this as a political anthropologist. The founding premise of a political anthropology of morality is the notion that moral sentiments are the bedrock of our common life. Our inclination to act in a political mode is both spurred and shaped not simply by what we think is right and good, or wrong and bad, but what we feel is right and wrong, or good and bad, and that indeed our moral sentiments may well play out in a political field before we ever find the conceptual language to put our feelings into words. So I'm going to be arguing in my talk today for an understanding of kinship as a moral sentiment, to be found not in conceptual language or argumentation, but in sounds, specifically in what we might call religious sounds, or the sounds of sung prayer and holy rites, of a 1700-year-old Middle Eastern Orthodox Christian liturgical tradition, as it is being openly innovated and experimented upon in the diaspora of Western Europe. One of the points I'll be returning to is this question of what linguistic anthropologist Michael Lambeck calls the immodernity of kinship, which is a way of understanding kinship not in terms of being pre-modern or anti-modern, but simply being immaterial to, or exceeding, or in some way eluding modernity's multifarious projects. It can't quite be captured or encapsulated by tidy logics of rationalization or liberalization or secularization. The young women and men that I work with in my research do all sorts of things they characterize as modern, from running their own tech companies to getting PhDs. But these activities are woven into a communal existence defined by its relationship with ecclesiastical authority, daily and weekly ritual practice, and a well-articulated sense of not only being beholden to the idea that Christianity is a kinship practice, but that in failing to see how Christianity is a kinship practice, secular Europeans and Western Christians have ethically lost their way. So I'll be developing these themes in two parts. In the first part, I'll give an overview of the field of inquiry to give a sense of who Syriac Orthodox Christians in diaspora are, a sense of their historical and theological background, and to introduce some of the key methodological challenges that this kind of informant-driven ethnographic research poses for social scientific inquiry. In the second part, I'll do a deeper ethnographic dive into one theme that I develop in the book, in which I look at how diasporic Syriac Christians understand the sonic ritual practices of their liturgy as a mode of political activism, aimed towards saving tradition from extinction by political violence in the Middle East and cultural assimilation in Europe. I'll conclude by reflecting on how their liturgical political activism recasts certain questions of cultural and political theory as questions of liturgical theology. Syriac Orthodox Christians are among those marginal, lesser-known religious minorities of the Middle East for whom there is no hyphen between ethno and religious, or at least not yet. Syriac Orthodox Christianity is one branch of the larger family of self-described Oriental Orthodox churches. These are the Christian traditions like the Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopian, and Eritrean Orthodox churches, as well as their schismatic offshoots, who see themselves theologically as Jacobites, which is to say, followers of the Miaphysite Christological doctrines associated with Jacob Baradaeus, a 5th century bishop of Edessa. This theological doctrine positioned these churches as politically subordinate to the imperial Byzantine orthodoxy espoused at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 of the Common Era, and since then they have been a dispersed and ever-dwindling minority in someone else's religiously authorized empire or secular nation-state. Since the late 70s, between 15 and 20,000 Syriac Orthodox Christians from Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and other parts of the Middle East have resettled in a rural Eastern Dutch region called Twente. So this gives you a sense of what life, what the monasteries look like in their home countries. And then this is Twente, in the far eastern rural reaches of the Netherlands. Here, in and around the post-industrial cities of Enschede and Hengelo, they've built a tightly knit, highly visible enclave around a rapidly growing number of parish churches, village associations, cultural organizations, and soccer leagues. Long-established patterns of migration from different regions throughout the Middle East have led to a noticeable concentration of family networks from an area in southeast Turkey called the Turabdin, the Mountains of the Servants of God, which is that region where those monasteries are located. Here, Syriac Orthodox Christians spoke regional variants of a Neo-Aramaic dialect called Soret, or Turoyo, in addition to Turkish, Kurdish, or Arabic, depending on what village they were from. Although since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, Syriac Christians who speak exclusively Arabic have been arriving in the Netherlands in greater numbers. While they remain virtually unknown throughout the Netherlands, in the region of Twente they are visible enough to merit dedicated liaison officers in both municipal governments and local police forces. In Enschede, they comprise 6% of the city's population and are heavily concentrated in the city's southern districts. And though they are not quite as populous there or as visible there as they are in Sweden, there's a town outside of Sweden outside of Stockholm called Södertälje, which is 99% Syriac Orthodox, and it's been sort of entirely remade as kind of the global capital of the Syriac Orthodox diaspora. But Enschede can hold its own. I've spent nearly 10 years returning repeatedly to the Netherlands to conduct fieldwork with Dutch-Syriac Christians with whom I've studied classical Syriac, participated in the liturgical and social life of several parishes, attended public events at a Syriac Orthodox monastery and self-described secular cultural organizations, and have maintained a number of long-term relationships, many of which are maintained now online. The strongest impression one gets from any time spent among this corner of the global Syriac Orthodox diaspora is of a fierce, widely shared attachment to a painfully attenuated and fractured tradition of ritual singing. Liturgical musical knowledge is transmitted almost exclusively by the memory of the ear, and village identities from the Turadin are reproduced through parallel practices of building churches and singing songs, and, of course, having babies with other Syriac Christians. At the center of the Syriac liturgical cycle is a book called the Bet Gazo, or The Treasury of Song. And here's kind of a view of the Christian village region in southeast Turkey that they call Turadin. At the center of the Syriac liturgical cycle is a book called the Bet Gazo, or The Treasury of Song. It contains nearly 1,000 hymns, although they tell me there were once many thousands of hymns, lost and forgotten long ago. Compiled over centuries from the institutional memory of the church community, with many songs attributed to the Syriac poet and theologian Saint Ephrem, who wrote and taught in the cities of Edessa and Nisibis in the 4th century. Among my research participants, Saint Ephrem is the most beloved and revered of the Syriac fathers, and he is the authoritative source of all that is considered most essentially and authentically Syriac. Saint Ephrem's position is partially based on his founding role and prolific authorship of songs in the Bet Gazo, but he is also revered because he is attributed with establishing the most distinctive feature of late antique Syriac liturgical identity, the Benat Kyomo, the Daughters of the Covenant, an institution of women's liturgical leadership that disappeared at some point, not quite sure when, in the medieval period, and which was revived in somewhat attenuated form in the 20th century. St. Ephrem's songs, as well as the songs of later saints, furnish the soundtrack for social life in the diaspora. And indeed, as of about 2 weeks ago, you can carry that soundtrack with you in an app for your phone. That's what it looks like. Social events are organized around annual feast and saint days, and the work and school week must be integrated into a weekly schedule of fasting, a vegan, pescatarian diet on Wednesdays and Fridays, daily prayers at home and at church, and preparation for Holy Mass on Sundays. The calendar is organized into an 8-week cycle marked by the microtonal modal system found in the Bet Gazo. Annual, weekly, and daily prayers can be sung in any of these 8 modes, depending on when in the cycle they appear. That means that every song has 8 different microtonal versions to memorize. There's no sheet music. This is no mean feat, and Syriac Orthodox children learn by doing as young as 8 years old. And here is a fairly representative example of how things sound in sort of everyday, although this isn't particularly everyday, this is Good Friday, but know if you could quite hear in the background there, but off camera, in the corner, in the front left corner, there is a cluster of white-robed young women who are singing in a call and response with the male cantors and subdeacons and deacons. This scene is from this most recent Good Friday in a church in the Netherlands in my field site. Because this is a holy day and the bishop is present, there's been a bit of rehearsal and coordination, but that's kind of special. On an average Sunday, things will look and sound quite chaotic as young women and men come and go depending on whether they feel like it. To describe this kind of liturgical singing as a formal choir isn't quite right, because in principle, anyone who knows the text is free to participate. But, as I'll describe shortly, this is a fraught issue. More importantly, because they are women and girls, the women that I sing with don't tend to receive much in the way of formal instruction about the sonic or the theological or the ecclesiological function of what they're doing. It's the rare young woman whose own father or uncle took an active interest in providing deeper knowledge of what is being sung and why. And rarely do women get the opportunity to master the classical language in the way that the boys and men do in church and monastic schools. They would have to go to university to get that level of mastery otherwise. So generally, unless it's a really special occasion, they're left to their own devices to figure out what they're doing and why. One thing to notice as well in that particular clip, and this is a fairly common thing throughout the churches that I sing in the Netherlands, is that the sound is kind of low and full and throaty. The singers are fairly in tune with each other in this text, but the texture and color of their voices have little dynamic variation. I kind of think of it as a quiet shout. This is what some of my informants described to me as the mountain sound, heavy and somber, just like life in the rural highland villages and farms of Turabdin. Entering into this field ethnographically presents two significant methodological challenges for a social scientist. The first has to do with diaspora, and the second has to do with gender. Syriac Orthodox Christian has always been diasporic. This means that while the liturgical tradition through which Syriac Orthodox Christians define themselves is singular, the local and regional variations in how the melodies of the liturgy have developed vary significantly, to the point where the church speaks of multiple distinct schools of liturgical sound, although most of these are close to extinct. The schools you can still hear throughout the diaspora are those of Turabdin, the school of the monastery of Mor Gabriel, which is in Turabdin, but it's its own school, the school of the monastery of Mor Matai in northern Iraq, and the school of Edessa. At least these are the ones that I was exposed to through my research. The school of Edessa is an exceptional tradition, now associated with the city of Aleppo in Syria, and it has a number of unique modes and songs not found in other schools. And this is a plug for my colleague Tala Jarjour in ethnomusicology, whose study of the sacred chant of Aleppo was released by Oxford University Press today, which is pretty exciting. In the Syrian context especially, there's been considerable cultural space for professionalization of this liturgical tradition, so that if you see Syriac Orthodox liturgical choirs performing like a professional choir, there's a great deal of influence from Syria, as well as from Lebanon. But because these traditions developed in isolation over centuries, hearing them reproduced in the diaspora, sometimes in the same moment of liturgical performance, can be jarring for all involved. For many people I work with, what matters is not how it sounds to outsiders, but that you reproduce in your church the distinctive sounds associated with your parents' or grandparents' or great-grandparents' village churches. It's okay that other people sound different. They're from a different village, even if they haven't been there in several generations. But there is a development afoot. Young women, in particular, are beginning to experiment with the sound of their voices, to explore what is ethically and politically possible within these liturgical spaces. It's very subtle and easy to miss, so I'd like to play another clip from YouTube. Or Facebook, as the case may be. Oh, the internet. The young woman featured in this clip is one of my closest field site collaborators in the Netherlands. We'll call her Marta. She is a Dutch citizen, a lawyer by training, an active leader in the World Council of Arameans, and a core member of the women's choir in one of the churches where I conduct fieldwork. This dinner took place in New Jersey after a day of workshops put on by her organization's Youth Academy, an international event put on every year to bring together young Syriac Orthodox from around the world to teach them about their history, identity, and ethnicity. I don't know if you can hear the scare quotes I've put around these terms, but they're there. Each of these concepts is exceptionally fraught with anxiety and debate. Every young person I know is in the process of sorting through competing theories and historical claims about the political visibility of Syriac Orthodoxy and making decisions about their affiliations and allegiances. Some, like Marta, participate in Aramean cultural groups, which emphasize the role of the Aramaic language and see the Syriac Orthodox Church as coterminous with Aramean ethnicity, while others are drawn to the Assyrian claim of a national identity shared with East Syriac speakers of the Assyrian Church of the East and the Chaldean and Syriac Catholic churches. The central tension underlying debates over what to call Syriac Orthodox Christians is whether ritual, that is, the liturgy of the West Syriac Rite, provides an appropriate boundary for public identity in a secular world. Those who argue for an Aramean identity say yes. Those who argue for an Assyrian identity say no. The implied question is whether liturgy is not just spiritually meaningful, but also something that can work as a politically and socially efficacious mode of organizing and representing communal life. Marta is among those who say yes. For her, a secularly legible Aramean ethnic identity would keep at its core the understanding that Christianity is a kinship practice. Such an understanding is reproduced through scenes exactly like this: ritual song, ecclesiastical authority, and the intimate practices of everyday life. At a relaxed dinner with friends and priests, the talk turns to sad things, and a song learned in childhood in church is sung to cheer everyone up, and is spontaneously recorded and distributed online for everyone else in the far-flung but intimately connected diaspora to hear. The song is explicitly nationalist. It can be sung in several different ways, depending on the political and ideological commitments of the singers. The text refers to the rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the land between them called Beth Nahim. The middle verse is controversial. For the sake of your Lord, tell me about the great glory, the pomp and circumstance of Aramaeanism. And now where is her beauty, the bride of light, our land Beth Nahim? Another version of the song refers not to Aramaeanism, or what they would call Oromoyutho, but to the broader ecumenical Assyrian nation, Othoroyutho. So we have sort of a proliferation of names, some of which are more familiar to outsiders than others. In southeast Turkey, they have historically been known as the Suryani. Variations of Assyrian could be Aturaye, Otoroye, Asuraya, Aramaean, Oromoye. Some people want to say we're just Syriac. That's good enough. And then many people, especially the younger generation that I work with, are very attached to the Aramaic term Suryoyo, which they say is the translation of Syriac. But then we get into debates about whether historically Suryoyo is actually a translation of Syrian as a shortening of Assyrian, or no, really it's Aramaean. So the fights go on and on. Anyway, back to the song. The other version is far more upbeat and danceable. The version that Marta sings with the priests is slower, lower, less intricately notated, and more contemplative. It fits aesthetically with the sound of liturgical singing as performed in her parish church, where she learned the song as part of her training when she was 8 years old. Marta's own account of the evening is characteristically deferential. She says, "Songs like this have inspired me throughout my childhood to remember who I am and where I'm originally from, and eventually led to my decision to join the Aramaean organizations. For a Dutch person, I am nothing more than a Turkish Christian, which is insulting, to say the least, if you look at our history. I felt the version I sang was much more appropriate if you consider the deep conversation we had just had about the ups and downs that our people are going through. Afterwards, we kept on singing one nationalistic song after the other, with the occasional hymn interwoven. Being a member of our church choir, I automatically adjust to my fellow choir members. In this case, the priests, who would no doubt sing along since they know the lines. In fact, I don't know a single Aramaean that wouldn't sing along if they knew the text. After singing the first verse, I lowered my voice to disguise my very out-of-shape voice and give room to the priests with their beautiful, rich voices. Personally, I think that there is some daylight between Marta's self-description and what I hear when she modulates her voice over the course of the song. She begins to sing with strength, volume, and confidence in a manner she's familiar with from her own parish's singing style. Within seconds, she hears the American priests at the end of the table singing slightly differently, and so she quickly softens and adjusts her voice to support the voices of the priests. Marta's voice didn't stay where it started. She is up to something. In her capacity as co-director of the young women who sing at her church, she is an innovator not only of liturgical sounds, but of liturgical singing itself, which means she actively experiments with questions of meaning, purpose, comportment, moral disposition, performance context, and reception. She works with a cohort of high school and university-aged students, mostly women, but also including some sympathetic brothers, cousins, and friends, to make Syriac singing presentable to a variety of audiences, not just to God. They absorb influences from secular and Western Christian music, as well as Arabic-influenced pop, and above all, their musical hero, Mariah Carey. Here's another clip to give you a sense of what I mean. The occasion of this event is also Holy Week, several years ago, and it's a special Easter broadcast made up of choirs from throughout Europe who are up to similar things. And hopefully we skip the inevitable ad for yoga. No. There it is.
Oh my God. They know who you are.
They know who I am. So this is broadcast on international Syriac Orthodox satellite TV. This is the choir that I sang with, but this is something they've made publicly available. Experimenting with the aesthetic qualities of texture, tone, dynamics, breath control, and vocal technique, and the structural layering of their voices over one another, not to mention their use of instruments. They and other liturgical choirs like them have created their own performance context, broadcast through satellite television into the living rooms of every Syriac Orthodox household in the diaspora that believes in their Aramaean ethnicity. The soloist, Petra, is a master of the liturgical repertoire. No mean feat for a 17-year-old girl, when even senior deacons trained in monasteries don't always have as strong a grip on the melodies as you might expect. Petra's achievement as a soloist and Marta and Rebecca's achievements as formal innovators is impressive because the tradition really is very difficult to work with, especially when you grow up in a setting where that's, that isn't the dominant kind of aesthetic mode for singing. But Marta, Rebecca, and Petra are fiercely dedicated, not only to mastering this tradition, but to staking out a set of claims about the kind of relationship that the sung liturgy, the source of everything Syriac, should have with the rest of their lives, and thus what the rest of their lives should look and sound like. Their efforts do not go uncontested. They would often try to make a point, through their singing in Holy Mass, to those other liturgical singers they perceived as uncommitted dilettantes, by trying to push them out with the sound of their voices, and by trying to make their voices strong enough to withstand resistance. They were willing, if not eager, to sacrifice the village identity of their church's accustomed sound. Learned from Rebecca's uncle, in order to sing more intricate melodic lines, or even to experiment with harmony. They would use hand gestures to direct rhythm and volume, but would struggle against singers who refused to rehearse with them and who disregarded direction during Holy Mass. For Marta and her allies, the ritual must be rehearsed, requiring qualifications beyond merely being Syriac by blood and tradition. For their congregational community, which also means their extended family network, this is a new way of thinking about the relationship between liturgical singing and kinship, even as it keeps that relationship at the center of social life. This claim that Christian kinship should remain at the center of social life puts people like Marta and Rebecca in a predicament vis-a-vis one of their primary audiences, the Dutch nation-state, of which they would like to consider themselves uncontroversially fully fledged members, but they are, from a secular Dutch perspective, morally and religiously conservative. The girls' unwillingness to draw a line around their religious lives and keep it contained as a minor category of social life puts them at odds with the social and political expectations that the Dutch state places on women from racialized religious minority groups. But Syriac women like Marta and Rebecca are keen to distinguish themselves not only from their Muslim peers, for whom they are often mistaken, but also from Western Christians, whose ethical dispositions they perceive as having, shall we say, been diminished by European secularity and vacated of any force or meaning. Marta and Rebecca shape their sense of what it is to be a good person according to conservative readings of the New Testament Bible, and especially the writings of Paul, who provides much of the church rules and customs that are taken to be essentially Syriac. There is a strong sense in which they understand their ethnic difference to be an ethical difference. Their liturgical practice is infused with this moral sentiment. And this is where things start to get politically thorny, because there is something in this fused connection between ethnic and ethical distinction that generates a problem. And it is to this problem that I will turn in the second half. One warm Dutch summer afternoon in 2010, I sat in the television room of the ground floor of the Syriac Orthodox Christian monastery of St. Ephrem the Syrian. Can't let you miss out on the picture of the monastery. I was there to do a proper interview with Marta and Rebecca after several months of singing in their parish choir. As we talked, we were constantly interrupted by curious nuns and rambunctious children, attended by parents and uncles and aunts visiting from down the street and from abroad. This was a typical day at the monastery, which serves many functions as a hub of social, political, religious, and cultural life for the tightly knit diaspora in Western Europe. And so it really wasn't surprising that despite having tried to prearrange some quiet time with the abbot, our conversation took place amidst such a boisterous scene. According to Marta and Rebecca, the monastery was the right setting for our first official recorded conversation because it was for the sake of this space, with its mix of ritualized patriarchal authority and domestic familial intimacy, that they worked so hard, both as liturgical singers and as political activists, to secure recognition for Syriac Orthodox Christians as an endangered, indigenous, ethno-religious minority of the Middle East. In a sprawling conversation that shifted spontaneously back and forth between Dutch and English and occasional phrases in Toroyo, they described their work and the lengths they go to in order to develop what they called their secular ethnic identity, and how that secular ethnic identity relates to their work, leading the women and girls of the church choir. They described their childhood memories of fleeing the rural highland villages of southeast Turkey with their families to escape violence between the government and Kurdish separatists. They remembered glimpses of village life, speaking with longing for a time when their mothers, aunts, grandmothers, cousins, and sisters lived intimately enmeshed lives, patterned by farm work, artisanal labor, and the daily sound of sung prayer, guided and protected by priests and bishops, living in the shadow of monastery walls that for 1800 years withstood Byzantine, Sasanian, Umayyad, Abbasid, Mughal, and then Ottoman imperial rule, until the coming of the secular Turkish state, which in 1932 expelled the patriarch from the monastery of Deir el-Zafaran to the city of Homs in Syria. But now, in the 21st century, they told me, it was important for the Suryoye, for Syriac Orthodox, to understand that in the modern world, you cannot be just Christian. You have to have an ethnicity. For the longest time, they said, in history, we were just Suryoye, just Christian. Of course, we were a people, which in Dutch would be folk. In Syriac, they use the word amo. But we were a people because we were Syriac Christian. In the past, that was enough. But now, if you do not have an ethnicity, Marta explained, you do not exist politically. As far as the world is concerned, we do not exist. Their lack of a politically visible ethnic identity was a problem, they said, for their efforts to claim funding for culturally sensitive programs and services from the Dutch government, as well as land rights to their monasteries in southeast Turkey, and global recognition for their experiences as victims of the Ottoman genocide against Armenians and other Anatolian Christians. Besieged from every corner, they told me, the Syriac Christian tradition is in danger of disappearing altogether, and they feel responsible for ensuring its survival by securing recognition and protection from more powerful states. To this end, they work as not just liturgical performers, but activists for the Dutch Aramaean Federation, the national affiliate of the Global World Council of Aramaeans, parentheses, Syriacs, formerly called the Syriac Universal Alliance. At the time of our first interview, Marta worked as a legal intern for the WCA, but she has since risen in the ranks to become the organization's international director for United Nations Affairs, in which capacity she regularly addresses the UN Human Rights Council, requesting humanitarian aid for Syriac Orthodox Christians targeted by political violence in Iraq and Syria. Marta had a hand in composing an important document posted in 2012 on the WCA's website, explaining the logic behind the Federation's name change and outlining their new strategy for trying to secure political recognition from various political bodies. This text illuminates how Marta and her Aramaean colleagues understand the way the UN and other powerful political audiences see them, or as the case may be, fail to see them. Today, it reads, with a fresh generation of dedicated young men and women, we believe that the rebranding of our name and logo are significant steps forward. Among others, they highlight our peoplehood, emphasis mine, and go beyond our linguistic, religious, and cultural identity. More specifically, it stops reducing us to a religious community, emphasis also mine. We firmly believe that the new name and logo will help us raise more effectively the neglected voice of the Aramaean people in the media and in political platforms and arenas like the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the European Union. This distinction between peoplehood and religious community mirrors a distinction made by the UN itself. The distinction is evident in the contrast between, for example, Article 4 of the UN Human Rights Council's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which predicates the possibility for corporate political autonomy to recognition as a distinct people, on the one hand, and Article 7 of the UN Resolution on the Elimination of All Forms of Religious Intolerance, which stipulates the state's unambiguous sovereign prerogative over the exercise of religious beliefs and practices, on the other. The question, of course, is, what makes a people? Of the sort that merits a measure of self-determination relative to a sovereign state. Certainly not mere religion. Yet note how, in the very same text, the WCA immediately reclaims the religious grounds of their peoplehood by rooting it in the sacral language of the liturgy. The term Syriac, it says, was kept to ensure the synonymous meaning of Aramaean and remind the world of the indisputable and fundamental truth aptly summed up by today's Syriac Orthodox patriarch. The Syriac language is the Aramaic language itself, and the Aramaeans are the Syrians themselves. He who has made a distinction between them has erred. By invoking the patriarch's position that the Syriac language is synonymous with the Aramaic language, the WCA authors echo a commonly asserted metonymic equivalence among 1, the vast family of Aramaic languages that have proliferated for millennia throughout the Middle East, 2, the 1st century Jewish Palestinian Aramaic likely spoken by Jesus Christ, and 3, the 7th century Syriac dialect of Aramaic still used as a liturgical and literary but rarely a spoken language throughout the 21st century diaspora. This triple metonymy invests classical Syriac, which Sir Yo-Yo referred to as Kvobanoyo, the language of the book, with a multi-layered sacrality, It is, according to Peter, the young man tasked with teaching me classical Syriac at the monastery, the language God speaks, and the only language that can unite the geographically dispersed and politically divided Syriac, who are otherwise torn apart by their tainted vernaculars. Toroyo, in particular, was a target of Peter's ire, because it was so heavily mixed with Kurdish, Turkish, and Arabic that it bore, in his view, almost no resemblance to the language of liturgy. Yet classical Syriac's symbolic power to transcend regional disparities and unify the diaspora politically is limited because of how those very same regional disparities have created highly uneven conditions for teaching and valuing Syriac. In Iraq, for example, Syriac reigned for centuries as Christians of the Church of the East, the Syriac Orthodox Church, and the Chaldean Church were linguistically and culturally incorporated into an Arabic-speaking world, until the 20th century when they were permitted to teach classical Syriac in schools in northern Iraq's Kurdish region. Syriac Christians in Turabdin, meanwhile, had been so marginal for so long that Syriac maintained its position in the liturgical life of villagers as much as that of monastics, until the Turkish government took active measures to suppress its teaching as part of an ongoing battle with what it perceived to be widespread separatism throughout the Kurdish-dominated region. The WCA's assertion, then, is positioned within a fragmented global field of power in which Syriac's legibility to other Syriac Christians has been differentially shaped by political conditions in their respective countries. These other Syriac Christians, according to the Patriarch and according to the WCA, have erred, and the consequences of such error, from Marta and Rebecca's perspective, are cataclysmic for Syriac Christian practices of irreducible relatedness, because it troubles the underlying connection between ethnic distinction and ethical distinction that they hold to be so vital to the survival of Syriac kinship. Marta and Rebecca tried to explain in that conversation in the monastery. They said, being Syriac is about family, they explained. If you did not grow up in a Christian family yourself, you will never understand. And this is something I was told in other situations by other people, and it's not that, as particularly me as a researcher, they were like, did you grow up in a Christian family? Yes? Okay. Not, are you Christian now? They didn't care about that part. It was, did you grow up in a Christian family? That was the crucial part. Trying to understand, I asked what I hoped was an incisive question. Is being Syriac a little bit like being Jewish then? Rebecca paused and then said, yes, but there is a difference. You cannot be a secular Syriac yet, like you can be a secular Jew. In 30 years, yes. Right now, no. If you stop believing in God, you are just not a Syriac anymore. If it happens, no one speaks of it. The person disappears from your life, and the family brushes it under the rug. Two different kinds of potential rupture are invoked in this conversation. The first rupture, a conventional notion of secularization as that power which produces ethnic identity entirely divorced from religious subjectivities, Rebecca invokes in a temporalized idiom. This, I would contend, is a Western Christian self-representation of the kind promulgated by her secular Dutch peers and encapsulated in the mythic self-narration of European and especially Dutch religious history. Once we were entirely religious, but we got over it. It happens to everyone. In the same breath, she invokes a different kind of breakage. At least for the moment, for Dutch Syriac, unbelief in God leads to a loss of ethnic identity. That is to say, becoming an atheist is not just a loss in terms of belonging to the community, but in terms of the thinkability of the claim to identity itself, as if unbelief could invalidate the aura of dissent that marks modern conceptions of the ethnic as an inescapable, biologically grounded social fact of personhood. Such modernist conceptions of ethnicity are already challenged by, for example, Jewish diaspora, which is why I proposed the Jewish comparison in the first place. Judaism breaks apart conventional secular social conceptions of religion as defined by, at least in part, by private interiorized belief, because diasporic Jewishness entails a number of complex negotiations of ethnic identification, ritual practice, and symbolic belonging. But the distinction that Rebecca insisted upon between Jewishness and Suryoyo-ness, I still think is illuminating. The question of whether a person's Jewish identity is predicated exclusively on genealogy or must be bolstered by ritual practice and belief in God, however loosely defined, is debatable. As in, it is fiercely debated. But it is not unspeakable in the sense that Rebecca meant it. Admitting to unbelief does not categorically dissolve your relationship with Jewish identity and your family. When Rebecca and Marta say you cannot be a secular Suryoyo like you can be a secular Jew, they mean that impiety, both in word and deed, can dissolve the genealogical link that produces ethnic belonging, just as ritual practice can produce it. This is a view I heard countless times throughout my field site. Take this example. Elena, a bank clerk by day, was a pillar among the church's youth leadership and a liturgical singer in a different town. One day in conversation over coffee, she broke down in tears as she told me the story of her aunt, who had left the Syriac Orthodox Church to join an evangelical Protestant church. It was a devastating loss to the family. Her aunt might as well have died. No one spoke to her or of her, and Elena had not seen her in years. Having left the Syriac Orthodox Church, her aunt was not a Suryeto, which is the feminine form of Suryoyo, anymore. Although she understood the political threat to the survival of Syriac Orthodox Christianity very differently from Marta and Rebecca, she shared with them the understanding that merely leaving the ritual community for a different Christian denomination results in a loss of ethnic belonging. I heard an even more extreme illustration of this principle visiting the family of Marta's cousins, Elisabetta and Mariana, who were liturgical singers at a different parish where I conducted research. Because it was a Sunday afternoon, the whole family was there. The older married sisters, Ilona and Karen, with their husbands and children in tow, their parents, a grandfather, a cousin, and an aunt visiting from out of town. In the course of the afternoon's meandering conversation, someone mentioned a terrible rumor that was circulating through the Dutch and German Syriac community. According to the rumor, a young Suryoyo woman in Germany had been disgraced for having been filmed during sex with her boyfriend several years prior. Someone, presumably the boyfriend, had put the tape on the internet. The day before my visit, the sisters had heard that the girl in Germany had attempted suicide. The women discussed the news with varying levels of dismay, disapproval, and skepticism. They all agreed that no one could say for sure whether the rumor of the girl's suicide was true, but Karen insisted that the original allegation was true. She claimed to have seen the tape for herself. Tremendous disgust. Elisabetta, the younger sister, wondered out loud at the fact that she had never heard anyone say anything bad about the boy involved with the affair. With indignation, she reminded her sisters and mother that the boy was also Suryoyo, and he was just as guilty. Why is he not spoken of the same way? Is that not a double standard? Her sister Karen and her aunt responded fiercely. Her aunt said, "It is better for her to have killed herself." Elisabetta was visibly offended by this comment and protested. But Karen turned to her and said with force, "You don't know what she did. She cannot present herself as Suryoyo after what she did." She repeated this point several times with heat. She cannot call herself Suryoyo. Beyond this, no one had much to contribute beyond head shaking, tongue clucking, and an attempt to change the subject. I think especially because I was there. But during this exchange, Elisabetta looked increasingly angry and flustered. She was at that time in training at a Dutch vocational school to become a social worker. She knew her sister's words, her insistence that Suryoyo identity and Syriac Orthodox moral conduct were inextricably related, and that it was better for the girl to have died for her behavior, were transgressive and upsetting, but she also could not, at that point, put up a counter-argument. The one position in my field site you might expect to be immune to this perspective is that of a secular Assyrian ethno-nationalist. Indeed, the Assyrian position on this dynamic of ethnic loss is more complex because, I think, of the greater legibility of Assyrianism globally, and in the United States in particular, where Assyrian, unlike Aramaean, has been a census category indicating a secular ethnicity since the 19th century. This complexity is evident in the story of Samila, whose career as an Assyrian political activist has been far more successful internationally than locally. Early in my fieldwork, I met her just as she was about to be elected to the provincial parliament for Over-Isle, and she had already established a prominent reputation among the global Assyrian diaspora, working closely with colleagues from the Assyrian Church of the East in the United States. In the 10 years I worked with Syriac Orthodox Christians from the Netherlands, I never encountered anyone else who shared Samila's open indifference, and that's the key, open. People feel things privately that they can't say openly. She said things openly, which was what was unusual. Open indifference to spiritual matters or to standards of pious gendered respect for the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In one of our meetings at her office in the town of Enschede, Samila told me point blank that if she could, she really would rather just be an ordinary Dutch woman living an ordinary Dutch life. But she could not, she said, because she felt a deep-seated moral obligation to her community's history. She felt responsible, she told me, for preventing the disappearance of that 1,800-year-old tradition. For her, saving Syriac Christianity was not about preserving religious ethics, effective relations, or the moral community formed around ritual practice, but about preserving material culture and securing the safe political spaces necessary to do so. In her early career, she had relied on the church to help her accomplish her aims. She depended on their cooperation, not only because they were the primary source of authority and means of communication with anyone else in her community, but also because they facilitated connections with local Dutch Protestant and Catholic advocacy organizations. Although Samila recognized that the church was the location of her community's culture and the steward of its identity, she blamed the ecclesiastical hierarchy for fostering the very lack of cultural and political awareness that threatens their survival. With her long experience in transnational political organizing across ecumenical lines and thorough education in English social science, Samila could articulate precisely what secular discourses of minority recognition demand. Visible evidence of historical continuity over a coherent and politically delimited territory. Nothing else matters. In Samila's diagnosis, Marta and Rebecca's approach gets the relationship between the religious and the ethnic backwards, while from her perspective, Elena's approach is entirely doomed to failure. Just being Syriac, just being Christian, that's not a thing. To succeed globally, in her view, the Syriac have to sever the ecclesiastical authorities' hold on the community's moral center. In the period after my primary fieldwork, she went on the record in a local newspaper stating that she did not believe in God. The effect was devastating. She was cut out of her local organizing networks and effectively went into exile, marrying a similarly inclined Assyrian and moving to the other side of the country, far away from the tight-knit community in which she had been raised. Regardless of whether they claim Assyrian nationhood or Aramaean ethnicity, as far as her constituents were concerned, when Samila publicly admitted that she did not believe in God, it meant she was no longer Suryoyo. Secular nationalist discourse is not new to Syriac Christianity. It has circulated in highly pressurized fields of power throughout the diaspora in the Middle East and globally for over 150 years. And yet, a definitive rupture between political and ritual modes of power in the reproduction of Syriac Orthodox Christian tradition has yet to materialize to any seriously significant degree, in my view. This is because young men and women like Marta and Rebecca labor diligently to reproduce the ritual modes of power through which Syriac Christian kinship is constituted as a moral community. The secular Syriac Aramean National Federation puts as much time into organizing Bible studies and meetings with ecclesiastical leaders as it does into organizing political gatherings and lobbying the Dutch government on behalf of Syrian refugees, specifically in order to keep religious concerns central to their political aspirations. Similarly, the secular Assyrian Mesopotamian Association in Enschede hosts weekly rehearsals of the St. Ephraim Choir, open to anyone who would like to join, which primarily performs the repertoire of classical Syriac liturgical hymns, in addition to some secular tunes written in the classical Syriac in the 20th century after the Patriarch released the prohibition on using the liturgical language for non-biblical themes. Even for Assyrians, there is no secular ethnicity without some kind of reference to that liturgical family tree. The future, and because there's someone who knows a lot about Assyriology in the room, I want to say that this is a very specific story about Syriac Orthodox Christianity, which things look different if you're looking at the Assyrian Church of the East. It's quite a different story. The future that Syriac Orthodox Arameans and Assyrians see for their secular ethnicity is not merely linked in a hyphenated fashion to the liturgy. It is authorized and mediated through liturgical practice itself. The purpose and point is an enriched sense that ethnic difference is defined by ethical difference, a Christian modality of irreducible relatedness in which ritual power, piety, belief, ecclesiastical authority, and intimate family relations are seamlessly interwoven. The difference between what the Arameans hope to make legible and what the Assyrians hope to make legible lies in conflicting understandings of such intimacy's political reach. Assyrian identification is an aspiration for national political autonomy predicated on a vision of the Syriac liturgical tradition as producing genealogical links across a spatio-temporal imagination that was diasporic from the outset, in which liturgical memory unfolds the West and East Syriac traditions, pre-Christian paganism and conservative Christian piety, and Persian, Arabic, and Aramaic language into a singular peoplehood. Aramaean identification is a narrower aspiration for relative political autonomy rooted in a narrower vision of the ritual's political reach, centered on the parish, which stands in for the village. But in either case, in many corners of the global diaspora, as in the Netherlands, you can lose your ethnicity by severing your relationship with the ritual power of the church. To conclude, tensions in Assyrian and Aramaean perspectives on the moral and political salience of Christian kinship echo long-standing tensions in how Christians of many traditions understand the relationship between peoplehood and religion. I began this talk with the comment that family and kinship are not always the same thing. Euro-American conceptions of kinship are deeply entwined with Euro-American conceptions of ethnicity. Both are rooted in an aura of descent, an understanding of genealogy defined by what Marilyn Strathern identifies as the biological idiom of kinship. In Euro-American thought and practice, to be really related to someone means that you are of the same blood, or as we now think of it, the same genes. And this biological idiom authorizes every other scale and modality of relatedness through the polity, as we see in how notions of territorial sovereignty in the modern nation-state system are rooted in the natal metaphor carried within the term nation itself. The symbolic power of biology in shaping Euro-American kinship practices has been inscribed into secularism by determining whether a particular kind of relatedness is recognized as inherent to someone's personhood, as in one's national or ethnic origin, or as optional, such as one's freely chosen religious affiliation. Crudely stated, ethnicity is of the body, religion is of the mind. Such a notion makes it logically and practically difficult, if not impossible, for the religious dimensions of a communal identity to furnish the ground of a politically legible ethnicity that entitles a community not just to rights of religious freedom, but to a measure of communal self-determination. But this is something of a secular and Western Christian self-misrepresentation, I contend, as even a cursory consideration of morality and moral sentiment muddies the waters immediately. The muddiness of these waters is evident in the earliest expressions of a distinction between ethnos and ecclesia, between a people and a church in ancient Christianity, as these fights mirrored ongoing debates over the proper dispensation of political and ritual power vis-a-vis disparate imperial formations. Throughout the ancient and late antique worlds, pagan Greek, Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic scribal elites engaged each other in ongoing dialogical and at times agonistic processes of demarcating the ritual and doctrinal boundaries and sociological terrain of their cosmopolitan worlds. Through these ongoing processes, key words like ethnos, tribus, religio, thrskeia lost in crude layers of commensurable and incommensurable signification, some of which are recuperated in secular modern usage and some of which are not. And I'm citing people like Brent Longbury and Barton and Boyerin's recent work on this issue here. Ethnos continues to be a contentious theological and conceptual problem for Western Christianity, as both Burkett Williams and John Bielecki have noted in their very different approaches to understanding the 20th and 21st century salience of the word in both Christian and secular social scientific discourses. In the mid-20th century, Williams notes, secular anthropological terminology shifted to a derivation of the Greek concept of ethnikos, which referred quite literally to barbarians at the border of the empire, away from the Latinate tribe, which originally referred to the three social groups from which the Roman citizenry were formed. Moving from tribus to ethnos was a resonant shift in terminology for a field grappling with its own implication in empire during the decolonization processes of the mid-20th century. In shifting to a focus on ethnicity, 20th century anthropology incorporated the religious connotations of heathen or pagan in the sense of disparate nations that did not yet participate in a Christian ecumene. It was Herodotus, William notes, who first defined a Hellenic ethnicity in terms of shared descent, using language for people of shared blood, shared language, shared sanctuaries and sacrifices, and shared customs. Such conceptual connotations remained a problem for translation from New Testament Greek to other languages used among early Christians, and such an integrated view of ethnos, I think, remains embedded in the Greek category liturgia, the root of the modern word liturgy, meaning the work of the people. Since shortly after the death of Jesus, self-described followers of Christ have met weekly to perform a series of liturgical actions that, woven together, define the character and scope of a given Christian community. Taken together, these actions, reading, praying, teaching, singing, confessing, baptizing, breaking bread and drinking wine, among others, are understood to be sacramental, which is to say, through these acts, the community encounters the divine and is constituted as a community as such. This is the work of the people in its founding moments. Liturgy is how Christians, as a collectivity, encounter God. How these sacramental actions are woven together, how greater weight is given to some elements at the expense of others, and according to what logic, not only make a community Christian, but mark what kind of Christian that community is. In the 2,000 years separating the Last Supper from the Gospel of Matthew, described in the Gospel of Matthew from the present day, performing these acts collectively as a congregational community has repeatedly driven questions to ask two burning questions. What is this work, and who are these people? Disagreements over these questions have shaped the history of Christianity globally, giving rise to a proliferation of heresies, schisms, and restoration movements, as Christians have realized that differing answers to the first question often leads to differing answers to the second. From almost the very beginning, these liturgical developments interacted with linguistic differences, intellectual orientations, cultural practices, social formations, and political structures across and among empires. These liturgical developments tendril out into matters of legal theory, marriage and the regulation of kinship, ethnicization processes, and eventually the ideological regimes through which empires, whether Christian, Islamic, or secular modern, maintained and maintain their power. In the Syriac tradition, which was shaped by problems of conceptual translation from the Greek very early on, the relationship between ethnos and ecclesia is articulated in a liturgical theology with a multifaceted approach to conceiving of ritual power. Syriac liturgy produces the Syriac amo, the people, through several different interwoven modalities that are often translated into English as religion. Taudifo, the Syriac rendering of the Hebrew word toda, for example, means confession, praise, thanksgiving, and doctrine, and is always understood as a relational, performative utterance towards the divine. Dehlo, which renders aboda from the Hebrew Bible, captures the affective dimensions of the liturgy, conveying the sense of fear and awe in worship. Korbono, the word my research participants most often used for the weekly Sunday morning liturgy, denotes the dimension of offering, oblation, or gift-giving as an act of drawing near to the divine. All of these words are saturated with the notion of rozo, literally translated from the Greek mysterion, mystery, but weighted with a distinctly Syriac approach to understanding the relationship between materiality and signification. Rozo is simultaneously a materialization and a symbolization of liturgical practice as partaking of the mystery of incarnation. The liturgy teaches theology to the people while also mystically incorporating them into the body of Christ. As liturgical singers, Marta and Rebecca work with a theological understanding of the ritual production of the church in the world as an expression of the incarnation. Their service is, in the words of the West Syriac liturgical theologian Rabbi Varghese, a relationship based on love and trust. It is intimate, affective, moral, and generative. It produces an irreducible relationship with the divine, and in the process, an irreducible relationship with those assembled. The question of whether a church counts as an ethnic group, then, depends on one's liturgical theology. This has caused endless epistemological problems for secular scholars trying to find evidence of ethnic identity among ancient Syriac Christians. It's a cottage industry. To posit or refuse the notion of ethnicity at all, I contend, is to take a theological position on the political salience of ritually constituted community, whether the modern scholar is aware of it or not. As historian Fergus Miller writes, the Suroi, Greek for the ancient Syrians, were not such an ethnos. And it is, as it seems, only Theodoret, in a letter from about 451 of the Common Era, the same year as the Council of Chalcedon, who describes them as such, calling Saint Ephrem the lyre of the Spirit, daily refreshing the ethnos of the Suroi with the waters of grace. Miller continues, while it seems clear that the designation Suros applies essentially to language, we cannot determine any clear divisions of either locality or social class as between them and the Hellenes, Greeks. And in any case, the evidence shows beyond doubt that there was extensive personal bilingualism, as well as regular translation of texts. End quote. Yet it strikes me that we cannot quite discount the words of Theodoret. The Suroi, or the Syrians, he said, were those Christians who sang with Saint Ephrem, the very same Ephrem who founded the women's liturgical choirs that Marta, Rebecca, Elena, Elisabetta, and Samila have all sung in. To Theodoret, the Suroi were an ethnos, and they were an ethnos because Ephrem and the women he taught sang. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Okay, all right. I think the floor is yours.
Since no one's jumping into the void, have you had an opportunity to study or encounter Syriac Christianity in India, which is still quite viable?
Yes. Yes. It is on the docket. It's certainly something I'm well aware of, and the liturgical theologian I cited is from South India, so there is actually a very vibrant theological tradition there. What's the word? Institutional. There's an institutional vibrancy there that has really been providing a service to the broader global diaspora for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done any research, ethnographic research yet, but it is certainly something that I'm interested in pursuing because it does provide an interesting kind of counter data point when I talk to my friends who are all from the Turabdin and have this very kind of regionally bounded sense of this is a tight kinship network. And I'm like, well, what about the Syriac Orthodox in South India? And they're like, wait, what? And so that's where, again, this idea of the regional, there are whole kind of self-contained worlds that throughout the diaspora. Even though it's tightly knit, you can also get a completely different picture of what the issues are and how people think about them, depending on the history, the regional history in the background of that particular line of migration. What people see in New Jersey, what people understand as there are communities in Brazil and Mexico that have much stronger connections with the Maronites of Lebanon, and they have a completely different story, even though they see themselves as part of the same group. So there's this kind of kaleidoscopic refraction of monolithic narratives that coexist with a whole bunch of other monolithic narratives.
Well, I traveled in South India and had the opportunity to, through family connections, meet and talk with people and attend liturgical services. And there was a lot of similarity with the vignettes that you showed there, both musically as well as the liturgical actions and the priests and the interaction of the voices and the priests and the singers and so forth. So I think you would find it very rich and in some way maybe more preserved, or at least one trajectory was preserved.
Yes, absolutely. I think so. The political conditions in which a liturgical tradition can survive and reproduce itself make a huge difference. That political context can really...
Yeah, they didn't have nearly the turmoil there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I understand that the Dutch anti-immigrant party of Geert Wilders has actually attracted quite a bit of following among the Syriac Christians in Enschede, which is sort of understandable and also sort of contradictory. So I wonder whether you have any light.
It depends on whether you believe the NRC Handelsblad newspaper.
I see. Okay.
That article that I imagine you're referring to, a couple of weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think, there was an article in one of the major national newspapers in the Netherlands about the Syriac Orthodox in Enschede, which was crazy because they almost never penetrate national attention like that, come to national attention like that. But the report was that the extreme right anti-immigration party of Geert Wilders, the Freedom Party, Partij van de Vrijheid, was making gains in Enschede because of the Syriac Orthodox, because the Syriac Orthodox the story is so resentful of Muslims, because they carry the weight of feeling persecuted, of not just recent persecution, but ancient persecution very heavily. This article made the rounds on my Facebook page. People were so angry. They were like, this is a vicious slander. We're not that dumb. We vote for the Christian Democratic Appeal. And I actually have an article in the works that's specifically about this issue that has to do with racialization and anti-immigration politics, and how it's much less about kind of the history of Syriac Christianity and much more about how Syriac Christians are racialized in the Netherlands in contemporary politics. And this question of so many of my friends are like, yeah, I've got an uncle who says he's going to vote for Geert Wilders, but he's such an idiot, and this is why. Like, we don't vote this way for these reasons. We vote for the Christian party because we're Christian. And then, or we vote for the Labour Party because our guy is running for their Labour Party, because there are a number of local municipal politicians from the Syriac Orthodox community. And actually there's one woman on the local Enschede City Council who's married to a Dutch member of parliament. He's Dutch, she's Syriac Orthodox, and there's all kinds of interesting. He's a trained economist. I tried to interview her in their house one day, and he was at the end of a table almost this long in their dining room, laughing at my questions, because he's like, what kind of social scientist are you? These crazy questions, because he's an economist. And so there's really interesting dynamics around the political and the municipal levels of governance interacting again through these family, through this marriage. Yeah. Anyway, yes. So that's a great question, and something that is really tricky, because every time Western folk talk about Middle Eastern Christians end up getting hurt, because they get sort of pulled into these political agendas and these political debates that are about geopolitics and all kinds of things. But there's sort of a long history of this in the 19th and early 20th century of using Middle Eastern Christians as a kind of a prop in Western Christian political games.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is coming back to liturgy and sound. Is there, in your experience, space for lament in liturgy or other vocal expressions that would get at, access the possibly grief, anger, dissent, anything like that?
So there's a yes and a no.
Yeah.
The lament is a huge part of the tradition in the Middle East, and there are some scholars who've worked on the tradition of lament, specifically Syriac women's lament. One of the problems of kind of even getting to that level is that in the diaspora is that these young women don't know what they're singing. They don't know if it's a lament or not. They have this faint note. I mean, there's this official church story about, each week in the 8-week cycle, what you sing and how you sing it, which microtonal mode you use is saturated with emotional and affect. So there's a week for lament. There's a week, we're supposed to sing in this particular way because this will make us feel the grief that Mary was feeling. Officially that knowledge is there, but the women don't really get taught it at all. They're like, we think that this might be going on. Like, we think we overheard the priest say something about what's going on this week in the liturgical cycle. They are really left to their own devices to a great degree. And I think that it varies. I think it varies depending on whether you're in Sweden. In places like Syria, there's an increasingly well-developed choir tradition where that's probably different. But for the women I work with, they wouldn't know. the meaning, they bring their own kind of, I think they're really doing this in, you know, what they're feeling emotionally doesn't have a lot to do with the official church authorized emotions that the songs are supposed to be feeling, because nobody bothered to teach them. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. This is awesome. I'm a Syriac Orthodox Christian, and it's so nice. I'm gonna tear up right now. This is so nice to see something like this. Thank you. Okay, sorry.
Thank
good. Oh my
you.
gosh, my
I
phone is
really
spazzing out.
appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh my God, if my mom was here, she'd cry too. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm good.
Recognition
Sorry.
is powerful, right?
Absolutely.
Like having people have heard of you. Someone's heard of you?
It's like, what?
Yeah.
Someone knows what I am? What?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
This is the grief. This is the lament. This is the grief. No one's heard of us. This is the ritual lament.
Sorry.
And it's political and it's emotional. Don't apologize. Thank you so much for being
Yeah,
here.
thank you. Sorry, now I gotta get my question now. It's sounding like dumb. Okay. So my family's actually not from Tor Abdin. My grandparents are from Mardin, which is very close to Tor Abdin. We mostly speak Arabic there.
Yeah.
My mom grew up in Istanbul. My dad grew up in Beirut. Had to move because of Christian persecution. Blah blah blah. But anyways, so like my family has no relation to like the language. However, we're very ingrained in the Syriac Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
For example, my great uncle was a monk at Deir Zafaran, which you just referenced.
Yeah.
He was the main monk there. And then my dad's a deacon. All my cousins are deacons. I'm in the choir. And just to go off of that, I have no idea what I'm saying. I'm like speaking in Arabic, and I'm like, what does this mean? But if I can pass this around if you guys want to see like prayers. But like it has it in English right here, and then it also has it in English, but it's like Aramaic. So it says like Ushano, but it's like O-O-S-H-A-N-O. It's not spelled in like the Aramaic language. Because like literally I can't read that. I'm from LA, I don't know how to read that.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. 'Cause
Yeah,
these women in Holland are like, I'm from Enschede. I don't know how to read this.
Yeah, like we don't know how to read it. Sorry, the point of my question is, how did you decide to go into this such niche group community of people and go into this? What inspired you to do this? Because I mean, I never hear any discussion, and if it is, it's very rare. So thank you again. But why did you decide?
So there were multiple routes. And the first piece, I think the groundwork was laid when I did my undergraduate degree in classics many years ago at the University of London. And my area of specialization was Byzantine and late antique Christianity, and I wrote a whole senior thesis about the transformation of the late Roman West. Never learned a damn thing about Syriac Christianity or ancient Assyria or something about the modern geopolitical boundaries of Europe were being retroactively projected onto late antiquity, so that in order to, my study of the history of Christianity was this completely Europe bound, like Western Europe bound. Many years later, I decided I was going to become an anthropologist. And in my first summer of language study, and because I am half Dutch, I was going to do a study about the Netherlands, about this was in 2006, and so things were really starting to get very tense in Holland about immigration and Islam. And so that's the project I was going to do, and I got there, and on the one hand, there was sort of researcher fatigue among the kind of Moroccan Muslim community that I was first looking at. But I also was studying Arabic that first summer, and my Arabic teacher was an Assyrian Christian from northern Iraq. And I was like, wait, what? How come I don't know this is a thing? And I was like, well, Google, are there any Assyrian Christians in Holland that maybe I could switch my project to? And I was like, oh, there's a monastery Enschede? I've never been to Enschede, so I called them from my father's house in Utrecht. Luckily, landed on the phone with the just arrived 34-year-old bishop who was finishing up his PhD at the Princeton Theological Seminary.
He came to my church in LA in January, and he's amazing. Such an elegant man. The way he communicated, he was like, "I'm from the Kingdom of the Netherlands," and I was like, "This is so awesome."
So I called, and the elderly nun who spoke nothing but Troyo was like, "I don't understand what this lady is saying." So handed me over to the bishop, who'd literally been there like a week, and he was like, "Hi there." I said, "I'm an anthropologist. I'm in the early stages of developing a project. I'm really intrigued by your community." I don't remember exactly what I said, but he said, "Well, you know what? This weekend we're having a huge festival in honor of my installation as the new bishop. Why don't you come?" And I was like, "Okay, I'll just go check it out and take a few pictures." And I got there, and they were like, and I was going to stay for a couple of hours, and they were like, "No, you're staying for the weekend." And I was just sort of, within 5 minutes, they were like, "An anthropologist wants to study us? You're hired." And I was like, they were not letting me go. After that first moment, it was like, finally.
Yeah.
But also with some pretty stern warnings from the bishop's brother about like, you're going to have a lot on your shoulders. This is a huge political responsibility that we have been written about by Turkish anthropologists in the past, and it's really burned us as a community. So people are going to be pretty hostile. I had to worry about people thinking I was a spy for the Syrian government. So I had really serious difficulties in getting access to the more recent wave of people from Syria. But because the bishop, and the bishop was like, "You know what you should do? You should study the women's choirs." So and because I was trying to understand this sort of kinship, this question of kinship, because I already had an inkling that something that's going on in European debates around immigration and racialization of religious minorities has something to do with who we imagine we're related to. And so I was like, I should probably do what the bishop says. So I became this very docile Syriac Orthodox daughter, and I didn't get access to the kind of authoritative ecclesiastical knowledge that I would have gotten if I had been a man. But it meant I got to go home with the girls and like hang out in the kitchen. And although there were some shifts around that too. At the monastery, I was always a scholar and was treated as a man. And so I never got to hang out with the women when I was at the monastery. But when I went home with the choir women, I was sort of brought into this kind of very effective, intimate domestic sphere where they very much had their own ideas about what the ritual meant and what the political significance of the ritual was. And the men didn't really get what they were doing, with the exception of, some brothers and cousins, like you saw in the video clip of like, yeah, this is something we're kind of doing together. But a lot of the elder priests were like, "What is this woman doing here in my way? Move." So does that answer your question?
No, it does. Thank you so much. I just feel like it's very interesting that you say that, like, because you've studied in the past and realized that you didn't know this community, so it intrigued you.
Yeah.
I've heard that narrative from a lot of different people who have looked into this. They've been like, "I did my undergraduate education, my master's education, and I never knew about this community."
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden something's like, I was exposed to it somehow, and then it intrigued you.
Yeah.
So it's weird that like we're not a part of any kind of institutionalized education, but
Exactly.
afterwards people are become intrigued by it from hearing about it from other people.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyways,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Very exciting to hear all the different angles on all of this. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the memory of the ear, which you referred to earlier on. I'm wondering to what degree the people you worked with think of that as inherited or as like a cultural memory, that's sort of passed on. And then following that, is the sort of orality that's being inherited being stressed by or affected in any way by the sounds of the Netherlands? So is it threatened in that world?
Right.
That's many questions, but
Oh no, those are great, and thank you so much, Scott. Thanks. Those are the questions I ask because they're really intriguing, important, and methodologically difficult questions to get at. People, in general, understand the memory of the ear. The bishop actually had a way of putting it very explicitly when I was asking him about this. Like, so how do I think about this and the fact that nobody quite seems to care about whether or not they're singing this quite the same note at the same time? And he's like, well, it's a complicated, difficult tradition, and these are young kids going through puberty, and so the key to singing is just to kind of find your spot sonically and just stay there. And so there's this sense of the cultural memory of the village, parish, church sound is really important, even when they know full well that the teacher, the malfono, the liturgical teacher, is making stuff up. And they're like, he's the malfono. He has the authority to do that. So, but there's still kind of some parameters around that. And one of the things that's so cool about the app that just came out is that it includes some quite old recordings, like from the 30s through the 60s, and it will say, this hymn was sung by this bishop or this deacon in Mardin or in Mormatai in the 60s, and this is the school of Mardin, or this is the school of, I forgot to mention the school of Mardin, of Mormatai, and so there is still a sense of like lineage, but then that gets layered onto, okay, we're having summer school at the monastery, and we've got people, all these kids coming from Sweden and Germany and Switzerland to learn these liturgical practices at the monastery. And now it's not just that you can hear like those old sort of village sound distinctions, but now it's like, oh, you're Swedish, oh, you're German, and it's really subtle. It's really, really subtle, and it can be as simple as the tempo, or you sing it higher, you sing it lower, you add in more flourishes, the sort of kind of Arabic tarab sounding like ornamentation. You wouldn't hear that ornamentation in the school of Tur Abdin, but you would hear that ornamentation from the school of Edessa via Aleppo. And if someone whose family is from Tur Abdin is throwing in some ornamentation, you're like, oh, you've been listening to the school of Aleppo, and you're like making a very conscious political decision to change your sound because you have this other political project going on where you care about who's listening and what kind of geographical and political history you want to invoke in the way you're singing.
Sounds like there's a lot of politics about whether you should go to the least common denominator, which sounds like the first thing you were describing, of like just find your place and stay there, versus taking on a decision to represent a specific school or place or lineage.
Yes.
Huh. Cool.
Yeah. And sometimes it'll be, it'll happen, the battle will happen in the middle of Mass on Sunday morning. You're like, Marta and Rebecca, they're trying to do something beautiful, and they're trying to do something beautiful in church for the benefit of other Syriac Orthodox Christians. And there are these other girls who are like, no thanks. And you're not going to keep us from singing either.
So that's perceived as not aesthetically preferred to have all the different things going on at once. There's an idea that it should be...
For people like Marta and Rebecca.
Okay, yeah.
But Marta and Rebecca don't get final say over who sings on Sunday morning.
Right.
They get to have a say over who goes to perform it for the satellite TV station, but not in Mass itself. Not in the liturgy proper.
How large is that community?
In the Netherlands?
Yeah.
So they're very difficult to count. My best estimate at this point is between 15 and 20,000, but that's based on basically the oral report from the monastery. Like this is.
But that community around monastery who gathered there, how large is? Not in Oru, Netherlands, but that community.
Right. So that's very, very difficult to count. Probably, I would say that most Dutch-Syriac Orthodox Christians live in Twente. There are 3, I can really talk more about parishes. There are 3 parish churches in Amsterdam. There are 8, now 9, in Enschede and Hengelo and Almelo. There's sort of the 3 big cities, and then there are 1 or 2 in the smaller towns in that area. But I would say at least 3/4 of the total Dutch community is based in Twente, around where the monastery is sort of the central hub.
So I have some more questions about the app after Rachel's questions. So are there multiple recordings of each song on the app? Like you said that these recordings, or is it just one?
So it's literally been out for like 2 weeks.
Right.
So I haven't had a chance to listen to everything on there. But my, pull it up really quickly. So it's got the colo, the melodies. From what I can tell, they sort of have a recording for each mode of the song. Whether or not it's the, from the more Matai school or from the, oftentimes they can only get sort of one version of that mode. And they don't necessarily have they haven't necessarily completed the whole thing, because there's so much. I mean, this is, I'm so wildly impressed. This is from the Beth Mardutho Institute that's attached to Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey. George Kiraz, the head of Gorgias Press, sort of this powerhouse of. What?
Are you serious? I'm not even kidding.
Oh wow!
Yeah, he's very famous in our family.
Yes, he is very famous globally, and he's a computer whiz, who writes dictionaries of ancient Syriac, and is the person responsible for making it so that you can have Syriac script on your computer So he's been doing all this incredible work for 20 or 30 years. And so their latest triumph is this app, but they're running around searching for old, lost recordings of old, lost traditions that and ways of singing that are just they're slipping away through our fingers as we speak. Every minute we lose another Aramaic speaker. Every minute we lose more and more of that oral memory. There is sheet music produced in Syria, but by sort of professional folklorists, but that never showed up in my field site. So it's
Well, the thing that I'm wondering about this, and this is not a question that you can answer now, obviously, but I'm wondering if the app might standardize the singing of these songs at all.
Depends on how widely it's used.
Right.
Because there are already MP3s in circulation. When I was there, they gave me a little USB stick to be like, hey, here's the Beth Gazo, or at least some of the Beth Gazo that we used, and they would have like their earbuds in their ear on Sunday morning, being like, how does the tune go again?
In church.
In church.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, interesting, cool.
Yeah, in church, because sometimes the elder deacons knew, and sometimes they didn't. There's a lot to learn. It's a vast repertoire.
Just to go off of that, I don't know if I can answer the question fully, but from my experience, it's not necessarily been about the standardization of it. It's not as important as just getting it out there, because it's so rare that it's not really, we haven't gotten to the point of we should standardize it across the world, because we're in India, we're in Western Europe, we're in the US. It's so hard to communicate with that, especially since we're all from different lineages, that it's hard to standardize it.
Well, and I wasn't actually trying to imply that standardization is important at all.
Sorry.
In fact, I was almost wondering the opposite, because
It's a danger. It's
right,
a danger
exactly.
to the diversity.
Because people
of the
have strong
tradition.
feelings about the version that is specific to their lineage. That's why I'm wondering if the app has that possibility of perhaps standardizing.
Yeah, I don't know. Because I do think it is possible, and I think I see them trying to be very clear, this, this is where this deacon or bishop recorded this song. This is the school, the style that he's singing in. Sometimes there's sort of liner notes. They're really sporadic right now because it's 2 weeks old.
Right.
But I think they're trying to. They understand that diversity and that richness is really valuable, and are trying to document that. But again, sand through, sand through your fingers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. 2 questions.
Yes.
The first is, you were talking about comparison between Jewish and Syriacs, and what I think one of maybe could be a factor, main factor between the two, is that maybe Syriacs don't have a country or a nationality that they can associate to. So I think maybe as if it's like a rope and it's being cut, and the only fabric is their religion, or let's say the Syriac Orthodox church that they can cling into. Comparing it to the Jewish component.
Absolutely. That is a huge, and I that initial weekend I spent at the monastery, I had this incredible conversation with a couple of young men who were who actually, now that I'm thinking of it, made the comparison. We're just like the Jews, except we don't have our own country. And I said, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And they're like, sometimes we think yes, sometimes we think no. And it's why I think that the political question is so fundamental to the constitution of the liturgical tradition itself. And this is absolutely part of why it hasn't been secularized in the sense of, okay, this is our church time, and this is our not church time. And because that relationship with sovereign power, and I think that this is a really subtle and kind of difficult thing, or it's been difficult for me to piece together, you know, what does it actually mean to have a country in a political sense? What does that mean for who you are? And so I started thinking about, you know, what is political power versus ritual power? How are they different? When are they different? Why are they different? How are they entangled? And ritual power in the Syriac tradition is a kind of political power because there is no sovereign space for political power to constitute itself as secular power. And so that means there's all this, but then you have these women who are like, and we'd quite like to keep it that way. Thank you very much. Some of them are like, no, we need our own state. Like Samila, she was like, we need our own state because this is ridiculous. We are literally going to be extinct in 30 years. And other people disagree. So it's a really contentious question, but it is really fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you. The second.
Oh, yes.
Second question. It's about the liturgy and music and the chants. So I was reading more about in modern Arabic music, for example, there's something called mushahat, which is kind of like poetry, but it comes from two sources. One is like the Spain Andalus poetry, and then one from Aleppo. And so I was reading more about it, and seems like the word comes from, it's a Syriac originally, which means like rhythm or sound verses.
Okay.
And it's fairly popular, like this type of music in the Arab world, especially the main singer, his name is Sabah Fakhri. He's originally from Aleppo too, and I think he grew up in like Orthodox church there.
Okay.
He's not Christian, but he grew up singing there.
Gotcha.
So I'm not sure if there's like a link or attachment between the Syriac Orthodox chants, mainly like in the 11th or 10th century, compared to what is now like where the Moshat comes from.
Yeah, there is a lot we don't know about roots and origins. A lot of people feel that they know. There are a lot of claims made. This is just a wide undiscovered country. The research hasn't been done. We have no clue. It would be nice if the research could be done before it's all gone. So I don't know. We don't know when the Syriac Orthodox tradition stopped having women's choirs. Was it the 8th century? Was it the 13th century? We have possibly in the 13th century, because Bar Hebraeus has this text talking about deaconesses in 13th century Baghdad. It hasn't been translated out of the Syriac yet, so not high on anybody's research agenda yet, unfortunately.
Could I add something?
Yeah.
In response to you? I study Tunisian music, including the Moshat. And I suspect that there are similarities if you can trace them in terms of the musical modes. That's where I would look in terms of connection. So like the sort of intonation, the scales, those sorts of things. But yeah, I don't think it's been studied.
Yeah.
You should do it.
I
hire you.
Because I liked the recent Moshahat music style, and then the Byzantine Arabic Orthodox chants that are very similar in terms of like the bass, the rhythm, the scale too.
Yeah, and of course, the people at the Assyrian Mesopotamian Center where I sang, they were like, these tunes are from ancient Assyria. And they, they
changed since time immemorial.
And they became Christianized. So they have their ideas about the roots of the modal system. Every other modal form in the world derives from ancient Assyrian modal music.